computer. All right. Welcome. Sorry if you had any technical difficulties about recording to the computer, but welcome to the unit on the Exodus. So were we in class, I would probably just do a little prior knowledge to ask you to post anything on that you already know. But since we're not here, just think to yourself, what do you already know about Exodus, the second book in the Holy Scripture? And then think to yourself, what is something I might want to know about the Exodus? All right, let's continue. So, the book of Exodus deals with two essential journeys that God's people, the Israelites, the Jewish people, our ancestors in faith, went on in their journey towards the promised land of Israel and towards a closer relationship with God. The first step is freedom from Egypt. The second step is establishing the covenantal law, the 10 commandments and the associated biblical commandments and laws detailing what the Israelites were and were not to do on their path to righteousness. So the Bible is in a little bit of an interesting position because there are some gaps in the Exodus period. Now, one of the most challenging parts when it comes to the Bible is dating things. The biblical authors don't really give a precise year-based calendar, certainly not anyone that we would be familiar with. They mention reigns of kings and lengths of the reigns of the patriarchs, but the lengths of the reigns of the patriarchs vary from semi-reasonable to much longer than expected to be humanly possible. So let's take a look at the gap. So in Genesis chapter 50, verse 26, we get this line. Joseph died at the age of 110. He was embalmed and laid to rest in a coffin in Egypt. Now, that is, the same Joseph with the multicolored coat, the one who is one of the patriarchs. Not the Joseph from Mary and Jesus, different Joseph. They're separated in time by over 1,000 years. Now, the next line, that line about Joseph died at the age of 110 and was embalmed and laid to rest in a coffin in Egypt, is one of the last lines we get in the book of Genesis. When the book of Exodus picks up, the next big detail we get is in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. We get this line. The new king, who knew nothing of Joseph, came to power in Egypt. He said to his subjects, "Look how numerous and powerful the Israelite people are growing, more so than we ourselves. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them to stop their increase. Otherwise, in time of war, they too may join our enemies to fight against us, and so leave our country." Accordingly, taskmasters were set over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. So here, that's what we know. That's what details the Bible gives us in the text. So what do we know? We know when Joseph was there, he was essentially prime minister of Israel. And we know that he brought his kinfolk, his family, to Egypt, and they settled in the region of Goshen. This is northern Egypt. This is what the Egyptians would have called Lower Egypt, what we call Northern Egypt. The Egyptians based upper and lower on the flow of the Nile, not on north and south. Sorry if that was a little confusing. But Nile flows south to north. Very few rivers do that, except curiously for the Wallkill River. This will not be our only reference to the Wallkill River in this class. It's really useful for Bible things. So we'll continue with that in a little bit. All right. So where were we? Oh, yes. So the next real detail we get is a new king who knew nothing of Joseph came to power in Egypt. Right? So all we know about this is he was prime minister. He's dead. New king comes to power, knows nothing about this guy's contributions, but is worried about the increased number of Israelites, the increased number of people who are ethnically similar to Joseph and his family, and that they might prove to be enemies in war. What's going on here? The Bible doesn't give a lot of indication, nor does it really give us a great indication about time. Is this the immediate next pharaoh? Is this a pharaoh a little bit down the line? It's not really spelled out. That's the trouble for a Bible historian, is that it's not precisely spelled out. But nonetheless, let's continue, because there's quite a bit more to discuss here in the Exodus. So the gap years. So much of our knowledge of what's going on in the Bible can be supplemented by what we know about the history of Egypt, because the Egyptians themselves kept fairly decent records of this time period. So we know a good deal about what else is going on in the wider world at the same time as Joseph is working the will of God in Egypt. So this period is what this roughly coincides with what's called Hyksos Egypt, which is a period that lasted from 1750 BC until 1550 BC. And the Hyksos means kings of foreign lands, not shepherd kings, as the historian Josephus would have us believe. Josephus is a very pious follower of the Lord and a very devout Jew of the Roman period, but his history of Egypt does bear more than a few mistranslations. Although he was very interested in the origin of the Israelites and of the role of Moses in Egyptian history, but alas, not all of his history is 100% accurate. Now, from 750 to 1550 BC. So that's roughly 200 years. And the title Hyksos means kings of foreign land. And these were Canaanite rulers. So these were people who came from the region of Canaan, what we would now call Israel and Palestine, a little bit of Jordan. That general area is where these folks came from. And they came across the desert. So let's talk a little bit about Hyksos, Egypt. So the Hyksos were a warrior people from the plains of what is now Israel and Palestine and Jordan. And these people basically mastered a unique trait. So Egypt, for those of you who studied Old Kingdom Egypt in school, when you all had to mummify a fish and do stuff like that, I don't know if they're doing that in virtual classroom anymore, but I really hope they are, because that was awesome back when I was there. Shout out to the middle school social studies team over at New Paltz Middle School. All right. But at any rate, one of the interesting things is Egypt had always assumed itself protected because of its deserts. The inhospitality of both the deserts of the Sinai Peninsula, along with the Sahara, had ordinarily been assumed to act as an ideal defense for the Egyptian people. But this was not the case. The Hyksos mastered a unique innovation, the rise of the chariot. Now, the chariot had already existed since the Sumerian period, but Sumerian chariots were pulled by mules and were four-wheeled carts. The Hyksos narrowed theirs down to two wheels upon a single axle and used a pair of larger horses. The increased speed allowed these chariots to more effectively cross the desert, meaning that the Hyksos were able to launch an attack on Egypt, which occurred when the Old Kingdom dynasties collapsed following internal infighting. And this infighting within Egypt opened up the opportunity for the Hyksos to enter and to take over what we would call Lower Egypt, the northern part of the country. Egyptian-born pharaohs, which were called Theban pharaohs, because they settled in the city of Thebes. Thebes, Egypt, not Thebes, Greece. I'm sorry, I know it's confusing for those of you who follow ancient world, but there are multiple Thebes. My apologies. I didn't name them. So you will ultimately end up dealing with this. So the Theban pharaohs settle in the south of Egypt, in what's called Upper Egypt, while the north of Egypt is inhabited by the Hyksos. These Canaanite individuals. And it's more likely than not that these are the Canaanite pharaohs, are the ones in power around the time of Joseph. Remember, we know Abraham left the city of Ur, and Ur really kind of stopped existing around 1800. So he couldn't have left. So that would put his, great grandson roughly in the time period of the Hyksos pharaohs. So it's very likely that the Hyksos were in power when Joseph came. So the pharaoh with whom he's talking is likely a Hyksos pharaoh. Now, that would also explain their willingness to collaborate with Joseph, along with their willingness to accept him and his people. After all, his family is going to seem very similar to them. Now, the Hyksos were masters of using the chariot in connection with the bow and arrow. This would later on be a technology that the Theban pharaohs would take from them and would later use to actually drive the Hyksos out in the end. But that's more of an ancient world history. But in case your social studies teacher hasn't gotten to it, that's the deal with that. All right. So what else is going on during this period, potentially in the gap years? Between the death of Joseph and the rise of Moses. Well, the other thing we got to discuss is New Kingdom Egypt. So in 1550, the Egyptian pharaohs from the city of Thebes rise up and expel the Hyksos from the Egyptian lands. And there's a description of them driving the Hyksos across the Sinai Peninsula with their chariots. And this gives rise to the 18th dynasty, beginning with the reign of Thutmose the Fourth, I believe it is. Or rather, I'm Thutmose the Fourth, who drives the Hyksos across the Sinai Peninsula. And then we have what's known as the Amarna period. And the Amarna period occurs under Akhenaten. So what do we know about Akhenaten? So Egypt undergoes an experiment with monotheism. Now, the Amarna period is so named because Egypt was governed from the city of Amarna. Now, Akhenaten is one of the later pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. And Akhenaten, he is the second to last, maybe third to last pharaoh of the dynasty, again, depending on certain history details. I mean, it concerns whether or not Nefer is or is not Nefertiti, because pharaohs take different reign names. But that's really not something you need to 100% know, but here's some of the details. During the reign of Akhenaten, Egypt abandons their polytheist religion for a brief period. They stop having multiple gods and worship a single god that Akhenaten calls Aten, or the god of the sun disk. And this is what we see in Amarna period art. For example, this is what's depicted on here on screen is a piece of art from the Amarna period. Please note, yes, the facial features of the pharaohs do seem a little peculiar. And this is due, one, to styling of the period. It's also due to the fact that many of the pharaohs, through generations of very close intermarriage, had a number of genetic defects. And the effects of these diseases were very much manifest in the pharaoh's physical appearance by this point. So if we look at this period, we notice the Egyptians are experimenting with monotheism, and there is a sharp reaction to this. So following the death of Akhenaten, Akhenaten is succeeded to the throne by a pharaoh named Nefer, we know very little about, and then thereafter by Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's son. Originally named Tutankhaten, he reinstitutes the Egyptian polytheist religion, taking on the name Tutankhamun, as in Amun-Ra. He is a very sickly child king who dies by the age of 19, ending the 18th dynasty of Egypt. He's buried in a very small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, but his tomb manages to survive to the 20th century, which is why almost every textbook in the history of 6th grade has an image of this man's sarcophagus in it. You may know him also as King Tut. Yeah, Akhenaten, his dad, in case you were curious. With the death of Akhenaten, we arrive at the 19th dynasty. Now, there was clearly a reaction against this monotheism. Now, does this monotheism have anything to do with the Israelites being in Egypt? We really don't know, right? It's certainly possible. After all, there would have been a very strong influence whenever Joseph was there. We don't know the name of the pharaoh that Joseph served under. The Bible never includes it. He is simply referred to as the pharaoh or as the king of Egypt and things like this. But he's never given a name. We don't know which pharaoh, and there are numerous pharaohs. So we're not 100% sure exactly which pharaoh he served under. Is it possible the influence of Israelites living among the Egyptians may have cultivated an interest or a curiosity in a monotheist religion, a religion that worshipped only one God? It's certainly possible. Did Akhenaten come up with his experiment in monotheism entirely on his own? But did the Israelites potentially suffer a negative backlash from a polytheist Egypt, deeply distressed by their brief experiment with monotheism? Again, we don't really know. And I know that's a weird thing to bring up, but this is when we're trying to narrow down when this happened. We don't know the answer to that. So what do we know with any certainty? Let's get back to Moses. So by the time we get to Moses, we're even still not 100% sure when the Exodus happened. And that is one of the more interesting phenomena. So I should mention, we're not 100% sure when the Exodus happened. There are 3 possible dates that are given. One is with the expulsion of the Hyksos, circa 1550. Another is reign of Thutmose IV, which I was mistaken earlier was in circa 1440. And then there is a final possibility, which is during the reign of Ramesses II. We don't conclusively know when it was. 1550, 1440, or 1260. We're not 100% on that. But regardless, here's what we do know. The figure of Moses. So Moses is the central figure in the book of Exodus. More of the book of Exodus is devoted to the life and times of Moses. And Moses is a prophet of God, and he's a descendant of Levi, one of Joseph's brothers. Now, when Moses is born, an order goes out from the Egyptian pharaoh that the firstborn son of each of the Israelites is to be killed. Hoping to spare him from murder, his mother puts him in a basket and sets him adrift in the river Nile. The basket ultimately finds its way to a daughter of the pharaoh, who takes the child in and raises him. She names him Moses. Now, the name Moses is a play on a Hebrew word meaning to draw up out of the water, since she literally drew him up out of the water. This is the etymology of his name that is given in the Bible. There's just one thing that is admittedly a little peculiar about that. Why exactly would an Egyptian princess give her child a Hebrew name? That part's a little less clear. However, some historians have noted that Moses, or Messes, is a common second half of an Egyptian name. See, in Egypt, a common thing was to say that an individual was begotten of or named after a god, under the protection of a god. So, specifically devoted to a deity. So, Ramesses, Ramoses, specifically devoted to Ra, Thutmoses, specifically devoted to Thut. You get the idea. So some historians argue that Moses indicates that perhaps she may have named him after some more Egyptian-sounding name, that since then, biblical authors decided to nix the Egyptian part of the name. Perhaps when he was born, he might have been known as Sekenet Moses or Happy Moses or something like that. We don't know. That's a lot of speculation on the part of biblical historians. Regardless, Moses grew to become a young man in the Egyptian court, but he knew that he was of Hebrew descent. While out observing the Hebrew slaves being kept under the Egyptians, he notices a taskmaster brutally beating one of the Israelites. He decides to intervene and ends up clubbing the taskmaster to death. Later on, when it becomes obvious to Moses that there were witnesses and people found out, he fled the land of Egypt so as not to be considered a murderer. There he settled in the land of Midian, in the Sinai Peninsula, where he met a young lady, they married, and they had children. So Moses is out tending a flock of sheep when he is suddenly visited by a unique image. He notices out in the distance that there is a bush, and the bush is engulfed in flames. But the flames do not actually engulf the bush. As he approaches, a voice cries out from the bush, and it is the voice of God. And he hears that, and he hears a message to, that he's heard, that God has heard the cry of his people Israel, that he is coming. He wants Moses to go down into Egypt and to liberate them. And Moses is, first of all, he's shocked. God has him, he takes off his sandals, he reverences, this is God that's talking to him. And that's not a normal thing. You don't normally hear directly from God. And Moses asks God a question. He says, what if the people ask me, the name of the God who sent me, what should I tell them? At this point, God gives the greatest non-answer in the history of non-answers. He says, I am who am. Tell them I am has sent you. If you're thinking at this point, well, what kind of an answer is that? That's the most evasive thing I've ever heard. You're right. So what's the deal with this I am who am? So this is what becomes known as the tetragrammaton, the 4-character word or the sacred name of God. Now, the title is admittedly a little weird, so let's break it down what it is we're looking at. So this is a Yud He Vav He. And how this word is pronounced, we really don't know to this day. It's an ancient Hebrew word. We talked about before, the Hebrew language did not include vowels until the Middle Ages, and by the time that it happened, the name hadn't been spoken aloud in centuries. But this is based on this thing which God says, which is, I am who am. Now, that may sound odd, but the word appears to be the causal form. Hebrew has a causal form, which is of the word to be, the to be verb. If you're familiar with Italian, it's very similar to the word essere. And the word, another way to put it is if the causal form of to be is to say the one that causes being or the one who is. And this is the greatest non-answer, but it's also a very interesting notion. that it's a name without being a name. Now, to you or I, that may seem like a weird thing. Well, who has a name that isn't a name? That's a little odd. Not how we do business. So I'd ask you to think, why do we have names anyhow? What's the point of them? Right? Let me ask, if you're still having a little trouble thinking of it, think of this. Very first day you come into school in a new classroom. Teacher begins with a roll call where they call out names, and they may even ask you to raise your hand, or otherwise indicate who you are. What's the point of this? If you're thinking so that they can tell us apart, congratulations. You've understood a great deal of names. The reason why names matter is because you need to know who you're talking to. In a polytheist religion, such as those of the Egyptians or Greeks or other ancient people practiced, the names of their gods were incredibly important because they had dozens, sometimes hundreds of them. So you needed to know exactly which one you were talking to if you needed to get something done, right? Well, right, if you're an ancient Egyptian and you want to have something done with the Nile, but you're praying to your god of justice, that isn't going to do you much good. It's not really who you wanted to talk to. But in a monotheist religion, in a religion with one god, the need for that god to have a name other than just the title of God is somewhat superfluous. It's somewhat excessive. It's not necessary. So despite this being perhaps the most evasive answer, it's also kind of the most obvious. God saying, I'm the one that causes being. I'm the one that makes the universe. And I don't really need a proper name. And Moses, smarter than the average human, and he gets that. And many suggest this might be when Moses starts using the title of just Moses, as in specifically devoted to a god that doesn't have a name. It's similar to the traditional Egyptian formula, specifically devoted to a god, but without the addition of a god name. Because he's devoted to a god that doesn't really have a proper name. He's just the one that causes being. So Moses returns to the land. Now, Moses also has another problem. He's not really a great public speaker. So God has a solution for that. He says, look, you're going to go and you're going to get Joshua to speak for you. Joshua's going to act like your prophet. He's going to come and he's going to do the public speaking, essentially. Great. Beautiful. So Moses comes down and he tells the Egyptian Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Now, a thing about slaves, both then and in later parts of human history, they're expensive. It may sound like a horrible way to think of it, but it's true. They're expensive. And it's not something you want to just get rid of. So when he approaches Ramesses, or whichever pharaoh it was, most historians believe it's Ramesses II, but it could well have been Tutmosis IV. It could have been any number of other pharaohs. When that happens, when he's approached with this question, he famously is not willing to do it. So Moses performs a sign in front of the Pharaoh. He takes out his staff and he tosses it onto the ground in front of the Pharaoh. And instantly, by a miracle of God, the Pharaoh watches as the staff transforms into a serpent. Now, if it was me that just watched some guy throw a stick on the ground and turn into a snake, I'd admit I'd be pretty spooked. It's definitely not something you see every day. Pharaoh was a little less easily shook up than most humans. He was apparently very used to this. Why, I don't really know. The Bible describes several sorcerers or court magicians who replicated a similar feat, throwing their sticks on the ground and producing serpents. The serpent that Moses conjured by way of the power of God ate the other serpents. This episode is of very little importance, but it does cement that the Pharaoh is not easily swayed. So Moses would go on to inflict a series of plagues upon Egypt at God's behest. The first was turning the Nile into blood. Please note, this was an incredibly big deal, as Egypt has only one major river, the Nile, and turning it to blood makes it pretty much useless for all the things that you need a river to do. You know, water your crops, act as your drinking water, keep fish that you're going to eat, all the usual things that one needs a river to do that a river can't do if it's suddenly made of blood. Now, this instantly was quite terrifying. But this wasn't the only plague that God sent upon Egypt. He sent frogs to hop into every crevice of Egyptian society, gnats, flies, various pestilences that killed the crops and animals, boils, hail to destroy the Egyptian crops, swarms of locusts to basically mad grasshoppers to consume whatever was left, a plague of darkness that lasted for several days. Now, if you or I were subjected to this kind of treatment, we'd probably be like, yeah, it's time to let these slaves go. It's not worth it. Moses found that Pharaoh was not exactly so easily swayed. And he continued to insist, no, he would not do it. It's of an interesting note that most of these plagues do kind of follow in a certain biological order. The turning of the river to blood would have caused the frogs to leave the river. The death of the frogs would have brought the gnats, the flies, the various dead insects, the pestilence, the boils from the pestilence. The hail, then, that's a little different. The locusts just kind of come every so often. They're a thing. America even used to have locusts for a while, fun fact. Darkness, that's admittedly a little less natural. And finally, we come to the death of the firstborn child. So the Israelites found themselves in a position. After almost all of these plagues, the Pharaoh was still not willing to let his slaves go. So God announces that he is going to send the angel of death into the midst of the Egyptians. Send the angel of death into the midst of those who are holding the Israelites captive. And that the angel of death is going to strike down the firstborn of every Egyptian, from the Pharaoh down to the lowliest peasant and non-Hebrew slave. Even the livestock were not to be spared. But there was a means by which the Israelites could mark themselves and could thus escape this terrible calamity. So, and this institutes the ritual of the Passover, one of the holiest feasts in the Jewish calendar, and a feast of considerable importance even to us Christians. So the Israelites were told to take an unblemished lamb, could come from either among the sheep or the goats, and they were to slaughter it. The lamb had to have no blemishes, no physical deformities. They were to kill it. They were to take the blood of this lamb and were to mark the doorposts of their dwelling with this blood so that it would tell the angel of death to pass over their house. The Israelites were then to roast the lamb and eat it with bitter herbs. They were to eat it as a people about ready to flee. That is to say, with unleavened bread that has not been, where there's not been yeast put into it, it's not been given time to rise, bitter herbs, and other associated dishes. That night, the angel of death descended upon on Egypt. And while the Israelites were spared, it struck down every member of the Egyptian society, including the son of the Pharaoh himself. This was the final act that would convince the Pharaoh to release the Israelites. This also established the Passover as an important night in the Israelite Jewish calendar, for it was the night that death passed over them, and God delivered them from slavery into freedom. But nothing is ever that easy. Now, fun fact, the Passover becomes such an important feast that it remained a major holiday in the Jewish calendar. And it is ultimately the feast of the Passover that Jesus is celebrating when he institutes the Last Supper. That's why unleavened, flat bread remains an important part of communion to this day. So the Red Sea. So Moses gathers up the Israelites and they begin marching towards the Sinai Peninsula. It is at this point the Pharaoh experiences yet another change of heart. And he sends out his soldiers, his chariots and charioteers, to recapture or else kill the Israelites. And we see a bit of a standoff. Now, God goes before the Israelites in the form of a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night, guiding them towards the Holy Land. As the Egyptians close in nearer, the pillar of fire stands between the camp of the Israelites and the camp of the Egyptians, so that the Egyptians may not do any harm to the Israelites. But the Israelites are trapped. Before them sits a sea. In some translations, it's the Red Sea, modern day ocean or sea, small sea between the Sinai Peninsula and the mainland of Egypt. Other translations mark it as the Reed Sea, something more akin to a swamp. Regardless, the day is coming. The Israelites are pressed up against the coast. And God tells Moses to stretch out his hand and his staff over the waters. And a mighty wind blew through that night. And it swept the water away, so that it was like a wall to the right and to the left of the Israelites as they walked across the sea on dry land. Now, the Egyptians saw this and decided, well, they can do it. Why not us? So they did. As the Egyptians rushed head forward into the sea, and the Israelites had finished their passage, God told Moses to stretch out his hand over the waters, and with it, the sea rushed in. It swallowed up the forces of the Egyptian army, chariots and charioteers. It was said, the Lord cast into the sea. A mighty image of God saving his people through the power of water and through the power of their belief in him. The Israelites would spend a good many weeks wandering the Sinai desert until eventually arriving at Mount Sinai. There, God would give Moses a piece of covenantal law. It's another covenant, an unbreakable agreement between God and his people. The basis of this law would become the 10 Commandments, which we will review next class. And the full description of these laws can be found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. It is here that we are going to end our class. Thank you ever so much for viewing, and good night. All right, we're going to stop recording.